thinking about our users and what their pain points are.
Okay, so let's say that Dropbox wants to change the logic of the trash folder from never permanently deleting anything in the trash to automatically deleting items after 30 days. How would you look into the data and validate if this was a good idea or not?
Okay, so we want to take a look at the logic of the trash folder. So currently we are never deleting items in the trash folder, but we are exploring whether we want to implement a new feature that would automatically delete items in the trash after 30 days. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. Let me take a moment to think about what structure I want to use to approach this problem.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so the approach that I want to take is first thinking about why we might want to implement this new feature, and kind of tying it back to the larger strategy and mission of the company, thinking about our users and what their pain points are,
Okay.
and then establishing a hypothesis and some metrics that I would want to dive deeper into to validate or invalidate that hypothesis.
Sounds good.
So, thinking back to the broader Dropbox mission, we are aiming to be the one place our users use to keep their life organized and keep work moving. And so, with all of the files that users are uploading and editing in Dropbox, there's bound to be a lot of files that get moved to the trash as well. And so I think that, as our platform scales and grows, this is bound to be a bigger problem, especially if we're never deleting anything.
Okay.
And just, I think this kind of strain could potentially have performance implications and kind of hinder our effect to kind of provide a very speedy and quick uh, experience for our customers. So I would want to, so I'm going to take a moment now to kind of think about our users and their pain points around this problem. And so when I think about our users and their behavior in Dropbox, I wanted to kind of think about, why do users move things to the trash folder? And so I think that there are kind of a few different reasons why a user might move something to the trash folder. So one, it might be they have uploaded a new version of something, and so they might move the old version of that document into the trash. The second one is they might have uploaded a duplicate of something. And so instead of keeping both things and taking up extra space in their Dropbox account, they'll move the duplicate into the trash. And then the third reason that I can think of is users, with the current behavior of never deleting anything in the trash, some users might kind of use that trash folder as an archive, because they know that, other items that they don't necessarily need on a day-to-day basis will not go away and stay in that folder. And so I would kind of think that most people are moving files to trash that they don't need anymore. So that's kind of my hypothesis. And so I'm going to take a moment now and kind of think about some metrics that I would want to take a look at to validate whether or not that is true.
Okay, sounds good.
So I do have a clarifying question for you. So just to understand this a little better, do items in a user's trash folder count against their storage limits for their Dropbox account?
Um, yeah, so I would say that it doesn't count against their storage limit, right? Because it's in the trash, right? And so
Okay.
you can't readily access it unless they then, let's say they like repurpose it back into their
Mhm.
regular storage.
Okay, got it. Sounds good. And are users able to only so users are only able to see the items in their trash can, and the only action they would take on it is to restore it if they wanted to kind of open that file back up. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Sounds good. Thank you. So some things that I would want to take a look at in answering the question, are my in answering my hypothesis, are users moving files to trash that they don't actually need anymore? So I would want to take a look at how often do users actually go into their trash folder. If we find that users are going in there pretty often, then I might make the case that they might be using it more as an archive rather than, a trash can where they just throw something and kind of forget about it.
Okay.
Um, I would also want to take a look at kind of along those lines, how often are items in the trash can uh, kind of, I think the only action we said you can take on it is restoring it. So how often are items in the trash restored? And then I would also, kind of along, kind of explaining that one a little further, if they are things such as, different versions or duplicates where users don't really need those items anymore because they either have another copy of it or they have the most recent copy of it, then I would expect that users aren't really restoring items from the trash can very frequently. And then I would also want to take a look at just kind of some general things, the average amount of items that users have in their trash, and kind of taking a look at on average how much file space are these things taking up. Um, I think that knowing that the trash doesn't count against their storage limits, it could be very possible that users are using it more as an archive. So I'd be interested in seeing, just the sheer amount of things in there. And so those are some of the items that I would want to take a look at in order to kind of proceed in understanding whether or not users are moving items to the trash that they don't actually need anymore.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's present a second scenario, right? And let's just say that uh, we've analyzed we've analyzed the first part, and we see that a lot of the usage is coming from users that are basically using it as an archive.
Mhm.
So now, what do we proceed with? And basically, like, what does that tell us about this feature change that we're about to make? And what more
Okay.
do you want to dig into?
Okay. Got it. Okay. Let me take a moment to think about the scenario. So there are a few additional data points that I would want to explore. So, kind of going back to a few things that I touched upon before, but now knowing that most users are, say, using it as an archive, I would want to take a look at, what percentage of users this is. And I would also reiterate wanting to know, how many items do these users keep in their trash folder, and just the total file size of these items in their trash folder. It sounds like these users are using the trash folder in a different way than is most commonly understood as so like they're using it more as an archive and kind of like a cold storage kind of thing instead of an actual trash can. And so I would say that this is an interesting scenario and would be interesting for our team to actually explore whether we would want to support this use case and actually build a new folder and functionality around this kind of archive use case. And so I think if we were to proceed with that, based on the data we have about, how many items people are storing and the file size of their trash folder or, their archive folder, we should definitely place some sort of storage limits for an archive folder. And so this would kind of increase by increment depending on the Dropbox plan that you're on. So for the free tier, we could give them maybe a couple gigabytes of free archive space. And then as, the premium tiers, they'll get a little more space as well. And so I think that I would, if we were to proceed with this new feature, I would want to make sure that we do have something in place. So like perhaps this new kind of archive cold storage folder for these users, just so they're not kind of left, with their files just kind of completely gone. I do think that just based on industry kind of standard functionality for a trash feature, I think it does make sense for us to either automatically delete after a certain amount of period, and provide this kind of alternative archive folder for them to archive their items, or start counting the storage in the trash against their storage limits, since they are kind of using it more as storage rather than a trash functionality.
Gotcha. Okay. So given all those proposals, can you maybe go back to one of them and kind of like talk about what kind of data points would influence either way decision? Like, so for the first one, it's like,
Mhm.
um, let's say it was like how many users are, using the trash folder, right? Like what percentage of
Mhm.
users are actually restoring something from the trash folder, right?
Yeah.
And so let's say we dive into that data and we get anything from, something super low or something super high, like what does that tell us about what we should be doing next? Like what data points there that we get back would influence our next decision almost. And so like, if it's something like, 10% of all users are doing it, like what does that mean? Like, does that mean that's really high or does that mean that's like
Mhm.
at all?
Okay, got it. Okay, let me take a moment to think about this. So just to give me a reference point, can you give me a number that I can use as number of uh, the number of gigabytes that a free user gets in their free plan?
Let's say they get like 20 gigabytes.
Okay, 20 gigabytes. Got it. Thank you. And so when we're thinking about these users that use the trash folder as their archive, how much gigabytes or storage are we seeing them store in their trash?
I'd love for you to just like make an assumption here and then
Okay.
say what you think the plan should be given that number.
Okay. Sounds good. So I would say that based on, so if I were thinking about a user that has, let's just use the free case just as a reference point. So, if I get 20 gigabytes of free data and I'm using the trash folder as an archive. So I also am kind of thinking about it in the free sense as well, just because I think that our users in the free tier are more constrained by storage limits. So I'm assuming that, they might be the ones that are more likely to kind of use the trash folder in this kind of creative way. Whereas our kind of more premium tiers have significantly a lot more data, so they might not need to use it in this way. And so if I think about our free tier users who get 20 gigabytes of space, free space in Dropbox, I would say that, they may be roughly storing, I don't know, maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 gigabytes of additional storage space in their kind of archive trash folder.
Okay.
And if we think about the amount of users that Dropbox has today, so there are 600 million registered users. And I think that, going back to something that you said earlier, I think that, even if we use a reference number of say 10%, so, even if 10% of people are using it in this way, and each of them are, say storing, an additional 10 gigabytes of data in their trash. 60 million users times like 10 gigabytes each is ton, a ton of extra data that we're kind of storing in the trash for free for these people. And so I think that would be kind of a cause for concern. And so I think that it would, I think I would want to kind of either start counting, I guess possibly either start counting this trash as storage. So, maybe say the first X gigabytes of stuff in the trash is kind of a freebie, and then the rest kind of counts towards your storage limit. Or we can kind of go back to our original feature proposal, which is kind of deleting the trash automatically. I think that in the end, it seems that these users that are using the trash in this kind of archival way, it seems like they do have a need for more storage space. So I think kind of implementing these sorts of measures could potentially help push them into a kind of higher paid tier as well, to kind of more accurately reflect their data storage needs.
Okay. So how would you know if they'd be willing to upgrade, I guess, if we
Yeah,
this feature change?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, I guess some things that I would want to take a look at and kind of explore is, where are the kind of gaps in our current pricing plans? Perhaps, users, our free tier users, are using it in this way because the next tier up, so like the lowest paid tier we have, might still be too high, and these kind of in between users are more price sensitive than the options that we're giving them. And so we could potentially explore launching a new kind of lower tiered paid premium kind of plan that has, maybe instead of 1 terabyte of data, it's something like more in between, like maybe they just need 50 gigabytes or something slightly more than the free plan. So I would kind of want to take a look at the kind of cumulative storage space that these users are using. So counting their actual storage and their trash storage as part of that. And kind of taking a look at, okay, on average, the total of, what they're storing in their actual folders and their trash, is it way less than, our first paid tier? And so maybe there's something kind of in between that we can kind of want to kind of compromise and kind of push these users into a paid tier.
Okay, cool. Gotcha. So I'm gonna stop the interview right there. We have
Okay.
10 minutes left for feedback and kind of review. Uh,
Okay.
First question I have usually is like, how do you think you did on the question, and like, what do you think about the question itself?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question. That was actually a good one.
Okay.
That you came up with on the spot. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of struggled with it a little bit because it didn't really fall into the kind of traditional buckets of, okay, like this is, or I guess it wasn't immediately clear to me in the beginning, like what the kind of business objective is, except for like possibly saving us kind of storage space and
Mhm.
cost associated with kind of storing these things for free. So it's kind of hard to kind of fit it into the bucket of, is this supposed to be generating growth or engagement or revenue or something? Um, so that was kind of like difficult for me to start with.
Yeah.
Um, and then I guess for me as well, I had trouble kind of making assumptions on like oh, like what is a reasonable amount of space for users to be putting in the trash if they're using it for archiving purposes,
Yeah.
and how much is like too much. So yeah, I kind of like struggled a little bit on that.
Yeah, so this question has a little bit of like a case question feel, more specific to maybe like consulting based almost.
Mm-hmm.
It's generally pretty broad, right? But it's still a
Yeah.
product feature change. And so I would say, starting from the good, I liked your initial hypothesis, right? So first off, stating the mission and then saying what basically why are we doing this, right? So
Mm-hmm.
specifically performance implications, right?
Yeah.
I'd like it if you dived a little bit more on that. And so I would say like
Yeah.
another one is the big one is monetary savings. Like that's the biggest one that I can see is that
Yeah.
we're not storing their items anymore. We're probably saving a ton of money on storage space. How much
Yeah.
we actually estimate how much money that is. Uh,
Yeah.
and then the third one I think is like kind of around organization, right? So
Yep.
like if we have a trash folder, like it should be for trash, right? And so
Yep.
it's almost kind of like changing like the way that the product feels almost instead of using it as an archive. And so it's like
Yeah.
obviously like I think one of these things that is intuitive from this question is that like maybe we're basically trying to find out like what is the change of making like this folder from like an archive feature into
Yeah.
actually a trash feature, right? And
Yeah.
um, that's kind of like the basis of like the actual question, I think. And so
Mm-hmm.
the next part, when you said why this idea, like why do users move things to the trash folder, that's great. That's a good move.
Mm-hmm.
I think understanding why the original product would actually be used, or why
Mm-hmm.
this feature change is brought up is good. And that's something that we kind of got to onto with the hypothesis, like, they
Yeah.
using the trash folder as an archive. And so
Mm-hmm.
saying that is really important because then we don't know what kind of data we want to dive into if we don't do that. And so
Mm-hmm.
you listed upload a new version of something, uploading duplicate using as a trash folder
Yep.
as an archive. And
Mm-hmm.
then my last reason that I thought of was that users don't want to pay to upgrade, right? And so,
Yeah.
obviously we got to it later is like if you have 20 gigabytes and you're at 19 and you have a new file that you want to put in, obviously you'll move
Yeah.
a ton of files out into the trash if
Mm-hmm.
you want to hit that ceiling. And so ultimately, I think in the data dive, I think you went pretty high level starting out, which is good, but I think
Yeah.
going deeper into a couple of good hypotheses is a better way to start. So like picking three good hypotheses and then diving into them a little bit
Mm-hmm.
deeper is better than shooting like a few more ideas and then just kind of not bring them up as much, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
one example of this is I think a couple data points that come off the top of my head are like, so how much money would we save, right? So
Mm-hmm.
cost of the storage of the items right now in the trash past 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
That should be pretty easy to compute. And so if we just know how much money that is, then we know
Yeah.
how much revenue that affects, right?
Yeah.
And then the second one is how much money would we lose from users that actually enjoy this feature, right? And so
Yeah.
what percentage of users recover an item after 30 days? What percentage of users recover an item at all from the trash? And just knowing that number amount, right? And then if we were to dive into that further, right, we'd be like, okay, so let's say that only 1% of users recover an item from the trash, and even like 1% of those users recover an item after 30 days, right? So then if that number is super low, we can measure that cost of how many of those are paying users
Mm-hmm.
versus how much we'd save from eliminating that feature.
Yeah.
And then just kind of make an estimate on like which one would make more money over the long term, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of like the trade-off scenario that we have to add in because all these
Yeah.
feature changes like specifically
Yeah.
add in like a ton of trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing I think is important is like how many users would upgrade to a new tier given they use the trash as a secondary storage method. If
Yeah.
change that, then how many people would actually then want an archive? And so I did think a couple of the ideas that you touched on were actually pretty interesting, right? Like what if we just
Mm-hmm.
created a new archive feature itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the issue is that when we want to keep it within the scope of this conversation, we
Yeah.
can't be bringing up new product ideas because then we have to
Yeah.
back those up with data too. So that's
Yeah.
the only thing. I think like uh,
Yeah.
specifically within these analytics questions, it's important to like focus on the question at hand and use data
Yeah.
for just like your hypothesis within this specific frame of the question.
Yeah. Got it.
So yeah, I think that's my most of my key points. I think you have the structure down pretty well. I just think that
Yeah.
you probably have to think of more ideas, and then if
Yeah.
you pause when they ask you a question, I think that it can get like too much so after like a certain point because they're trying to
Mhm.
have like a normal conversation with you at that point. And so it's
Yeah.
to then pause, right? Because they're kind of like trying to like go back and forth and kind of like think about how you might think of it. And so I'm not
Mhm.
actually sure if you've had an interview where they like, have you ever paused and then they were like, no, no, don't, or just
They no, that's never happened, but yeah, I mean, I guess that's something that I constantly struggle with too. It's kind of like taking the time to like fully flesh out my thoughts before speaking versus like just maintaining the flow of like a conversation. So
yeah.
that's definitely something that is a challenge for sure.
Yep, yep, definitely. Yeah, I think at least on the analytics side, like they're looking for a lot of the metrics that would influence the decision, and then the
Hmm.
assumption from what you might get from those metrics if they're on one side or the other, right? Because
Yeah.
hypothesis always has two sides, and
Yep.
so if you validated your hypothesis, then what does that mean? And then if your hypothesis is invalidated, then what does that mean? And I think making that distinction is really important because it allows you to like dig more into like the second layer of like the problem at hand,
Hmm.
right? And usually if you
Yep.
don't answer that question, then they'll ask you that question and then you won't be prepared for it. So if
Mm.
you answer that question yourself, then it's much
Yeah.
easier to prepare for it later on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. That makes sense.
Cool. Any last thoughts?
Um, so I kind of feel like we are supposed to arrive at a definitive yes or no at the end of this type of question, but I guess I'm curious. So should I be kind of asking for them to make up numbers for me along the way so that I can reach a kind of yes or no decision? Like when I was asking, like, oh, what percent of users are using it as an archive, or like on average, how much storage space are people taking up in their trash? Should I be like asking them to make up numbers for me, or like how do you approach that?
I think you should not ask, and you should just,
Hmm.
I mean, you can ask, you asking that question is good because it shows that that's something that you would dive into, but
Yeah.
you can't assume that because if they give you a number,
Hmm.
like, it's almost like a second test because if you just answered your own question, then
Yeah.
you could, dive into analysis of why that is because of your own answer, right? But if they like you propose this to them, right? Then they're
Hmm.
then forced to give you a answer that you might not be prepared for, right?
Hmm.
I think that's the only thing is that like there is no definitive yes or no with any of
Yeah.
these for sure.
Okay.
Because there is no like they're not going to give you the data for it, right? Because
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. They're just kind of like proposing like random feature changes and just trying to like understand your thought process, I think. So
Yeah. Got it. And then, so I guess going back to like one of the questions you asked me in our thing, so you kind of gave that example of like 10% of users, and I kind of just stuck with that. And I was like, okay, 10% of 600 million registered users, that's 60 million. And then I made the assumption of, 10 gigabytes in the trash, and 60 million times 10 gigabytes is a ton. But yeah, I mean, I guess what is the correct way to answer your question where you're like, oh, like, how do you determine whether it's too many people kind of using the trash folder in this way?
Yeah. So I would say that trade-off is against the cost of storage plus
Oh, yeah.
cost of people uh,
Got it.
not
Okay.
upgrading, right? And so
Yeah.
then the question is like, okay, so how do we know if people would upgrade if we did this feature change? Well,
Mhm.
that then requires like maybe we should test it. Like maybe we could run an A/B test, which is
Mhm.
totally doable for Dropbox actually. Maybe not because it's like such a big feature change, and so then
Mm.
it's like, how do we analyze this without A/B testing? Then it's just like looking at the usage data, right? It's like
Yeah.
understanding and estimating the cost of what would happen if we shut this off, like what percentage of users would instantly be like, I'm canceling Dropbox now because I use this feature all the time, right?
Yeah.
Obviously if they use this 90% of the time, then they're going to cancel now, but like then there's a portion
Yeah.
that don't use it all the time, they use it like 50% of the time,
Yeah.
and you can then assume like they'll cancel 50% of the time, right? So it's like
Mhm.
it's extrapolating like data from
Mhm.
stuff that we can't when we can't test it, and
Mhm.
that's just kind of like the analysis that we have to run.
Mhm.
For this. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for doing this with me. I'm
Cool.
gonna stop.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay.